The RFZ-2, the UFO. Before the end of 1934, the Vril technology had already achieved its well-deserved triumph. The RFZ-2 was probably completed just a few months after the accident with the RFZ-1, but certainly before the winter of 1934. And the RFZ-2 now looked like a real flying saucer, according to today's ideas. This small round aircraft, whose diameter was just over 5 meters, worked, and from 1941 onwards it would have a remarkable fate ahead of it. The RFZ-2 goes to war. The debriefing of the war phase, now known as the Battle of Britain, revealed significant weaknesses in German air armament. In 2001, the German Air Force had fought at a ratio of 2-1, i.e. the British had lost twice as many aircraft as the Germans, and there can be no talk of a victory for the British, but the problem of the German aircraft's insufficient range had become apparent. The scrapping of the 4-engine long-range bombers, which were not thought to be needed because the leadership had not believed in a war, now took its toll. As did the sale of the best fighter aircraft, He-100 and He-110, to foreign countries. The German standard fighter Me-109 was fast and maneuverable, but basically only suitable for the defense of the Rhine, since its short range did not even allow 20 minutes of combat over London, let alone escort missions to Scotland, where the British could therefore produce their armaments undisturbed. And even in reconnaissance, long-range aircraft were lacking, which is why Lufthansa's civilian transatlantic aircraft had to be temporarily converted. The Vril production site was a complex that was partly completely underground, and partly about 2/3 underground. Although the above-ground buildings have all been destroyed, their images could still provide information about the location. Since it cannot be ruled out that some of the underground facilities are still there, we were asked to cover up all features that could be used to determine the location in the photos. At this stage, people remembered the funny round thing that had been demonstrated once in 1934, and that nobody had taken seriously because it had no real wings, no tail unit, and not even a propeller. Just as the first jet aircraft, which flew before the war began, was literally overlooked for years, the first jet aircraft, which flew before the war began, suffered a similar fate. But since this funny thing was there, which could fly unbelievably fast, and had an enormous range, it was taken out of a shed and dusted off. It was fitted with a square, armored pressurized cabin, and also equipped with 2 Mk-104, 2 cm, machine guns. Then test flights began. Flights. That was in the late autumn of 1940. The RFZ-2 had a major problem. The impulse control only allowed changes in direction of 90 degrees 450, or 22.5. This meant that it was not suitable for use as a fighter aircraft. But it could be used effectively as a long-range reconnaissance aircraft. And it was used for this purpose from 1941 onwards. The flying hot water bottle. There were 2 reasons for giving the RFZ-2 this nickname. Firstly, because it really did look a bit like an old hot water bottle, and secondly, because it quickly became murderously hot in the tiny cockpit. The entire RFZ-2 was only a little more than 5 meters in diameter. The cockpit was so narrow that the pilot had to lie on his stomach with his legs drawn up. For an experimental aircraft, this had not been a problem, but now the flying hot water bottle had far-reaching consequences. Reconnaissance flights. For this purpose, a telescope, guided downwards via many prisms, was installed. Despite all adversities, the RFZ-2 is said to have served well throughout the war, even as far as America and the Antarctic region. The RFZ-2 had no landing gear. It took off from a wooden frame. The 3 high landing stilts had to be cranked into the airframe from the outside before takeoff. They were then sprung out for landing using a spring mechanism. Despite all the makeshift measures, the flying hot water bottle is said to have proven its worth. Nothing is known about the whereabouts of this round plane. The only known photo of RFZ-2 from the mission taken by a FW-200 crew over the South Atlantic. RFZ-2, the Flying Hot Water Bottle. The aircraft was given this nickname not only because it looked a bit like an old hot water bottle, but mainly because it quickly looked like a very hot bottle in the tiny cockpit. So the RFZ-2 quickly lost its nickname. All 4 people in our crazy group, that's what the few top people in the company who knew about our work called the aircraft hot water bottle for short. Ikeson's work began in late autumn 1940. The plane was already around 6 years old at the time, and no one had ever taken care of it. Now 2 2-centimeter cannons were to be mounted, which had come from a crash-landed Mi-110. Our crazy idea was not considered worthy of new pieces. And with good reason, because it turned out that you couldn't shoot accurately with a hot water bottle. But the plane itself worked fine, and was also used again and again as a long-range reconnaissance aircraft. Such flights were torture because of the narrow cabin. The entry hatch measured 45 by 110 centimeters, and you had to roll in. Then you had to assume a position half lying on your stomach and half kneeling flat. On the right-hand side at the front there was the control stick, a tiny thing, on the left the gas, and next to the viewing slit an eyepiece for a telescope pointing downwards, which produced an image through countless prisms. The RFZ-2 originally had a glass cabin, but I have never seen it. I only know it with the metal cabin, with the viewing slit and the portholes. But at least it was a pressurized cabin. In addition to the heat caused by the oppressive confinement in the cockpit, there was something else unpleasant. When the engine revved up and built up its own field, you were in a weightless state for a few minutes. It was only when the hot water bottle flew that you got over it. But then it was a very pleasant flight, without centrifugal forces. The speed you could fly with the RFZ-2 was so fantastic that nobody would have believed you. And when I say, you could fly to America in around 4 hours, and so high that you were more in space than on Earth, you would be laughed at. It was probably the fate of this invention that nobody believed the reports, least of all Judith and Goring. If we had said we could fly 600 kilometers per hour, then perhaps something would have progressed sooner. But as it was, it remained with well-intentioned, but weak support from the SS, which demanded total secrecy. I have heard rumors that Hitler was furious when he later learned what an opportunity we had missed, because with this technology, we could easily have had an America bomber in 1942. The ignorance was certainly also due to the fact that the hot water bottle was very small. Later, proof was provided that the same technology could be used to build a 45-meter-tall airplane. I mean Vril 7. RFZ-7T, V7. It was a time of progress in all areas. Germany had the fastest cars, the fastest and longest-range airplanes, the first proper television during the 1936 Olympic Games, the best entertainment films, etc. Soon the first jet planes were flying, and the first long-range rockets were being developed. All of this is well known. Since conventional technology was now on the rise everywhere, experiments were also carried out with conventionally powered round aircraft. However, it is conceivable that these were originally purely test objects, with which the aim was to find out how a disc-shaped aircraft behaves in the air, in much the same way as the Mi-262 jet fighter was initially tested with a conventional piston engine. However, the RFZ-7 then developed into an independent flying disc program, which would later become known under the code name V7. The history of these V7 objects of conventional interpretation is not directly related to our topic, and so much has already been published about them that we can limit ourselves to the bare essentials. Starting in July 1941, the Schriever-Habermas and Meath-Belouzot development groups built several conventional flying discs, then joined forces to form a development team, and created functional round aircraft with jet propulsion, conventional UFOs. On April 17, 1945, Dr. Richard Meath reported these successes to Adolf Hitler in detail, supersonic speed, and altitude of around 24,000 meters. These, conventional UFOs, contributed greatly to the creation of legends about the German flying discs. Since the secrecy here was not as complete as with the unconventional ones, presumably no one in Germany suspected that the English had known about the unconventional Haunebu aircraft for a long time. One of the few photos of conventional flying saucers shows a launch in the Prague area. The UFO is wearing white winter camouflage paint. RFZ-7. In my opinion, all the conventionally powered flying disc projects were waste products of tests for the new type of flying vehicle. This began in 1936 with an attempt to make a disc-shaped device fly, which was then achieved in 1938-39 with a simple gasoline engine. The aim was probably nothing more than to see how such a cell shape would behave in the air. Due to the strict secrecy and mutual isolation between the individual development groups, it was probably not known in those circles that RFZ-2 had basically been working since the end of 1934. But perhaps they did not trust this design either. The jet gyroscopes, that were later talked about so much, Mirte, Schriever, Habermas, etc., were either unexpected byproducts, or perhaps a deliberate diversionary tactic from the other RFZ projects Haunebu and Vril. However, there is serious evidence that some of these devices even became functional. The last version of the V7 RFZ-7 probably already represented a combination of conventional and unconventional technology. A photo of this V7 exists in the USA, but we were unable to obtain it for this book. Foo Fighters, Fireballs and Bubbles. The Allies used the collective term, Foo Fighter, to describe various German missiles that had a glowing or spherical shape in common. In particular, there were two inventions that fell under the term Foo Fighters, the flying turtle and the soap bubbles, two completely different things that were, however, considered to belong together by the Allies. The flying turtle, also called Fireball, was developed by the technical department of the SS, but not the SSEIV, in Wiener Neustadt. These devices were remote-controlled flight probes. Their external shape was reminiscent of a turtle shell. Only in the air did the fireballs, or flying turtles, develop a brightly glowing halo due to a special fuel admixture, which then gave the optical impression of the typical Foo Fighter. The purpose of these flight probes was to disrupt the ignition systems of enemy bombers. This technology was based on a further development of klystron tubes, but it probably did not work as well as was expected. The effective ignition shutdown, that the SS picturesquely called death rays, was only created later, and probably using other technical means. Since then, this ignition shutdown, the failure of electrical systems, has been typical. When UFOs appear. In this passive weapon, there is also a little. The ideological component of the search for non-violent weapons. A completely different matter were the soap bubbles, often referred to as Foo Fighters. These were basically nothing more than simple balloons containing thin metal spirals to disrupt enemy aircraft radar. They were intended to particularly irritate the scout planes of the Allied bomber units. The success of this idea was probably minimal, apart from the psychological effect. Soap bubbles came in various sizes. For night missions they were mostly black, and for day missions they were mostly made of light, or almost transparent foil. In principle they were small adaptations of weather balloons. These bubble Foo Fighters continued to amaze people long after 1945. Some of them rose into the stratosphere and wandered around the world without an owner, only to cause astonishment somewhere as UFOs. As Japan also tried to release bubbles due to the German-Japanese relationship, it is almost a given that they would appear in the Japanese and Korean regions, and the Japanese bubbles also lasted for years, of course. Not all UFOs were round. Dr. Lippisch designed an unusual fighter aircraft, the DM-1. In the test phase, this small aircraft, with a recoil drive, reached a speed of 1,360 km per hour. Later, however, a mini version of the SM Levitator, Vril engine, was to be installed, for which the SM Levit, which powered the small RFZ-2, was to serve as a model. This effort was the logical conclusion from the knowledge gained up to that point that the small and disc-shaped aircraft were not capable of carrying out typical fighter-turning maneuvers that were common in air battles with enemy fighters. Superior speed was not enough for this purpose, and above all it must have been a fundamental problem to combat aircraft technology such as that of the Allies, which must have seemed almost prehistoric compared to Vril aircraft, with means from a completely different intellectual and technical level. The DM-1 concept was therefore a result of the consideration that a middle way had to be found. December 1944. Vril people on the up. The Vril 1. After the separation of the Vril Society from the Thule Society became increasingly clear, and the distance between the Vril people and the state leadership increased, a distance had clearly developed, not least of all ideological. While the Thule people could rely on massive support from the SS, the Vril people were largely alone. They were certainly not outspoken opponents of the National Socialist leadership, but they were also not compliant supporters of the state leadership. As a result, the Vril Society could not count on state support for its projects. This changed after the success of the much ridiculed RFZ-2. There were now more opportunities for the Vril people than before, although not nearly to the extent that the SSEIV Black Sun, the direct arm of the Thule people, was able to achieve. Vril 1. The Vril company received its own premises in Brandenburg and further support. This meant that the Vril 1 project could now begin. The aim of this development was obviously a fighter. And the Vril 1 was successfully built in several versions. In addition to the single-seater version, there was also a two-seater version with a relatively large plexiglass dome. The successor model, Vril 2, was probably built as a prototype, but then scrapped. But this is not certain. The universal fighter for the defense of the Reich was certainly planned in the Vril 9, which was never built. The disadvantage of the Vril design was the large, space-consuming Vril engine. The advantage, however, was the quick and cheap production method and probably also the astonishing reliability. The Thule engine. In competition with the Vril engine, but certainly in a friendly competition with an exchange of experience, the esoteric engine, launched by the Thuentuppanes, also developed an unconventional drive unit. The Thule engine, later SSEIV and SSEV. Named Thule Tachyonator. Initially, this development was certainly not in competition with the Vril engines. The aim was rather to create an energy source for Germany that was independent of raw materials. Germany was largely dependent on crude oil from abroad. The production of petrol from brown coal was already a step towards independence from oil, but this was still far from sufficient. The rest was about the ideologically founded idea of the divine source of power. Many ideas that in a certain way seem highly topical today. Despite all other difficulties and the enormous numerical superiority of the enemy, it can be said that Germany lost the war, especially on the raw materials front. So it was economic considerations that led to the Thule engine. If the production of flying discs had been the main focus, these would probably have been available as early as 1943. The Haunebu I was already flying in 1941. If the information is correct, this large round aircraft was lost during a reconnaissance flight over the Irish Sea. However, the main focus of the SSEIV was probably not on the flying discs, but on the energy source itself for a long time to come. Thus, the Black Sun only started to build flying discs relatively late, probably only after had to look for last resort options. Typical Haunebu shape with Thule engine. The British had information at their disposal as early as 1941, through betrayal or espionage, which they apparently did not take seriously at first. Thule engine, Haunebu, and DOSTRA. In contrast to the Vril Society, the flying machines inspired by the Thule Circle with the Thule engine probably enjoyed strong support from the leadership, although their production method was much more time-consuming and complex in every respect. SS Development Department 4, which emerged from the Thule Circle. SSEIV round aircraft of the Haunebu series from the Allies. However, they had the advantage over the Vril technique. Due to the space-saving Thule engine, significantly higher payloads. The cell construction was also completely different. The Thule SSEIV type, Haunebu 2, was in fact already designed for the series. Between the aircraft companies Dornier and Juniper, a tender is said to have taken place, which was announced at the end of March 1945. Dornier was chosen as the winner. The official designation of the heavy flying top should read Doostra equals Dornier STR Atmosphere aircraft. It is known, however, that this series production never took place. The pre-series of German UFOs were basically series only in terms of the engines, while the external features always differed. However, it cannot be completely ruled out that a small series of Haunebu 11 or Doostra was still possible. The various UFO photos that appeared after 1945 with the typical appearance of this German construction suggest this possibility. The Kohler tachyon converter. Without going into technical details, there are enough other publications on this. The tachyon converter invented by the German Captain Kohler must be mentioned briefly, as this technology was used on the SSEIV for the Thule engines. This was one of the differences between the Thule engine and the Vril engine. The Kohler tachyon converter was also prepared and planned for series production for other applications from the end of 1944. The Gemagic Eye. On the sidelines of the history of the Thule tire factory, the project of a tiny flying spy should also be touched upon. A thing called Gemagic Eye is said to be planned, the size of a man's fist. Being that could fly through every window slit as a sort of spy, that could watch and listen, silently and uncannily, in order to be able to carry out espionage in the enemy's centers. This Gemagic Eye was to be dropped from the air over enemy territory, and then remotely take up its positions, which it could then change at will. Equipped with a self-destruct mechanism, it would also have been the forerunner of a long-range flying mine. However, it is difficult to imagine that in 1943-44, it was technically possible to produce such small television cameras and listening devices as would have been necessary for the Gemagic Eye. Today, however, such a construction could easily be put into operation, especially with Japanese help. Who knows whether UFOs are now deploying various Gemagic Eyes to spy on important information. EIV, Practical, 1944, 2. December, Haunebu Series. Original document. Haunebu. November 7, 1943 SS Development Office 4. Haunebu 2, 1944. Medium heavy armed gyroscope, type Haunebu 2-inch. Diameter, 26.3 meters. Drive, Thule Tachyonator 7C Armored, TY. Disc, 23.1 meters. Control, Magfield Impulsor 4A speed, 6,000 km per hour, calculated to be possible up to approximate 21,000. Range, in flight time approximate 55 hours. Armament, 68 cm KSK in 3 rotating turrets, below, 111 cm KSK in 1 rotating turret, above. External armor, 3 bulkhead Victorine crew, 9 men, additional transport capacity up to 20 men. Space capability, 100%. Ability to remain still, 15 minutes. General flight ability, day and night, regardless of weather. Basic operational suitability, V7 85%. Availability of Haunebu 2-inch, if the tests continue to be good, like V7, from October. Then series production from the turn of the year 1943-44, but still without improved Dynacak, IIIV, power beam cannons, whose readiness for the front cannot be assumed before early summer 1944. However, the 100% operational readiness required by Pura cannot be expected before the end of next year. Only from about Series 9. SS Development Office 4 responsible for the investigation, the new German technology, and thus above all flying gyroscopes and KSKs, is being rejected due to the still time-consuming manufacturing processes, especially with the Thule devices, an extremely laborious material. A UFO on Flight Route 1 over Jacksonville, Florida, USA. On February 11, 1967, Jamie Romee photographed the flying object over her clothesline. This UFO photo presented George Adams Sky, 1952. However, there is also the claim that it was not in 1952 in California, but already in early 1945 in Norway. Haunebu 2 in low-level flight. Haunebu, the Mars spaceship. At a time when the future of Germany and its few allies was already extremely threatened, the SSEIV built the giant flying disc, Haunebu 3, with a diameter of about 71 meters, the largest aircraft of this type ever known. There are two specific references to a Mars flight by Haunebu 3, which was probably launched on April 20, 1945. Mathematically, Haunebu 3 could have reached Mars. This venture has been written about in other books, so we will restrict ourselves here to the aspect of it that may be directly related to the Vril Project. The Vril Project was based on the assumption that Allied forces would be brought in from another world. Perhaps Haunebu 3 was supposed to prepare a base on Mars for this purpose. This is undoubtedly a very bold assumption. But what other reasonable reason could there have been for the often controversial, but perhaps real flight to Mars? Table model of the Haunebu 3. Built, or rather reconstructed, by a German private researcher. Andromeda device, Thule's dream of the most distant cosmos. Andromeda device EV, December 2, 1944. Armed carrier and long-travel spaceship, Andromeda Gerat. Probably inspired by the Dimension Channel, Vril Projects, and convinced that Thule spaceships should also be able to reach the most distant realms of the cosmos. The special unit was formed from the SSEIV to develop and build the Andromeda device, the giant cylindrical spaceship that was to serve as a mothership for the Haunebus and Vrils. This new department, the SSEV, worked on a spaceship project that was certainly not named Andromeda by chance, because this long-distance spaceship equipped with 4 Thule engines was probably intended to initiate an organized conquest of distant space. It is difficult to say how far this project progressed. It probably never got beyond the paper stage, or initial experiments. However, various UFO photos have emerged later on, showing devices reminiscent of the Andromeda device project. Gyroscopic flight testing, status and number of test flights. CM KSM 3 by 7 cm KSK. Landist. Haunebu I. 2 pieces available. 52 EIV. Metallage. Lagbra. Haunebu 2. Hawes. 7 pieces available. 106 EIV. Haunebu 3. Available 1 piece. 19 EIV. Vril I. Thule 11. 17 pieces available. 84, Schumann. 3x 7 cm KESK. 111 cm KSK. 1 Haun. 2. 2x VRIL 1/2. MPI 68. 139 M.